Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of our symposium titled Making Democracy Real, Encouraging an Active Citizenry. I am your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, I would like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment in an offering of respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. In our second session, we will be taking a deep dive into the history of a 50-year effort to undermine voting rights in America and its profound implications for the 2024 presidential election. Our guest speaker for this session is adept at researching the historic patterns that have led us to the current political moment. David Daley is an investigative reporter, best-selling author, and a regular commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and other outlets, where he regularly discusses the subjects of democracy and voting rights. His national bestseller, Ratfucked, helped spark the drive to reform gerrymandering. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, amongst other publications. He is the former editor-in-chief of Salon and makes his home in Massachusetts. This session is called Antidemocratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. It is titled after the recently published book of the same name, authored by Mr. Daley and published by Mariner Books. We will be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase books. We will also be making time at the end of our session with which you'll be able to ask questions, so please do post those in the chat function. Join us now in offering a warm welcome to David Daley. It is great to have you with us. Welcome to City Lights. Oops, I think you're muted. Let me unmute you.
Thank you, Peter. What a lovely introduction. What an amazing afternoon of events, and I'm thrilled to be included. So thank you for having me. Let me jump right into it. We are on the eve of the 2024 presidential election, and our democracy stands on a precipice. A lot of people, I think, would trace this moment to that one escalator ride everyone stopped to watch. Donald Trump's gilded descent that formalized his leap from reality TV into American politics. I want to suggest that the crucial moment took place much earlier, that it was much less flashy, quite easy to miss, in part because its central player did not radiate star power or any villainy at all. No, when John Roberts appeared before the U.S. Senate for his Supreme Court confirmation hearings 2 decades ago, the only vibes he exuded were Midwestern dad next door. Roberts presented his boyhood as something straight from a John Cougar Mellencamp song. He spoke nostalgically of an Indiana boyhood surrounded by farmland that stretched to the Indiana horizon, punctuated only by a silo or a barn. And he explained the approach he would take as Chief Justice using another American civil religion, baseball. He would be a Chief Justice who modestly called balls and strikes. Judges are like umpires. Umpires don't make the rules, they apply them. The role of an umpire and a judge is critical. They make sure everybody plays by the rules, but it is a limited role, he said. Nobody ever went to the ball game to see the umpire. Roberts's memorable metaphor has defined his image as Chief Justice and shaped his image in the press, which has cast him as a modestly conservative institutionalist whose greatest interest is the integrity and stability of the court. My book, Antidemocratic, proposes the opposite, that Roberts's effective baseball analogy has disguised a far more radical approach on the bench, patient and strategic, but radical all the same. So much so that a quite different analogy would be more effective. Roberts isn't the kind of Chief Justice who tosses a frog into boiling water and scares it so it jumps out. He welcomes the frog, he makes it comfortable in the pot, then imperceptibly brings it to a boil. The frog, in my tortured metaphor, is American democracy. If you care about its future, you need to care about the courts and need to understand how Roberts, the steady incrementalist bulldozer, has gradually over 2 decades transformed the Constitution, the state of our elections, and remade the balance of power, shifting it from voters, the ballot box, and our elected representatives to an unelected body of 9, appointed for life bound by no ethics code, whose decisions reached in private are final and, unlike baseball's umpires, non-reviewable. Roberts has not done this by himself. His ascendance and that of the broader conservative legal movement he represents is the culmination of a well-funded 5-decade strategy to win control of American politics through the courts. It began as a reaction against the Warren Court's steady expansion of rights and liberties throughout the 1960s, and a backlash against the multiracial democracy that the Voting Rights Act attempted to build and that the Warren Court so fiercely defended. The right has built and maintained a powerful network that carefully cultivates the cases, funds the organizations that find the litigants and bring the litigation, covers the 7-figure legal bills for white shoe DC representation, supports the law schools that generate the dubious legal theories that fill the amicus briefs they also pay for, and then place before ambitious judges, trained, handpicked, and kept in ideological line by the Federalist Society. All of this has turned the Supreme Court into our highest political trophy and the true base of Republican power. In short, John Roberts is not an umpire. John Roberts might even deserve a grander title than merely Chief Justice. John Roberts is the most effective Republican politician of a generation. Roberts has delivered victory upon victory to the conservative movement on guns, abortion, the regulatory state, campaign finance, voting rights, whether or not former President Trump can operate above the law. Victories that Republicans could never have won at the ballot box for the simple reason that most Americans oppose them, and victories that the conservatives could scarcely have imagined in 2005. When Roberts was confirmed, conservatives yearned to accomplish these goals, but lacked the court they needed to do so. Pre-Roberts, a less stringently ideological, yet still conservative court defended the precedent in Roe, avoided Second Amendment controversies, upheld the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reforms, deferred to federal agencies on crucial questions of their own regulatory power, okayed race-conscious admissions to higher education, and did not yet dare take on something as sacrosanct as the Voting Rights Act. To understand how thorough and anti-democratic the Roberts routing has been, how effectively he has moved the nation and the Constitution, just consider how differently those issues stand today. There are a lot of ways to tell the story of the modern court. About Leonard Leo's billion-dollar dark money octopus, about the creation of originalism as an intellectual fig leaf to create the kinds of outcomes that conservatives desired. What I want to talk about is voting rights, race, and our elections. Excuse me for one moment while I sneeze. Or not. I want to talk about how John Roberts has done a slow bleeding of the Voting Rights Act, the most effective civil rights law in American history, how he froze the enforcement mechanism that made it work after it cleared the US House 390 to 33 the year after he was confirmed, how it was passed by a unanimous Senate, signed into law by a Republican president, buttressed by a 16,000-page record created deliberately by Congress to demonstrate its clear intention and the clear need for the continuation of the Voting Rights Act. This modest and humble caller of balls and strikes, who appeared from Chief Justice central casting to insist that he enforced the rules and did not make them, would undo all of this, not using any version of law recognizable to liberal or conservative scholars, but off his own vibe that things had changed in the South, off his own desire to turn the page and declare history's wounds healed, supported by a legal standard that he creatively invented himself, a chart, in his opinion, that misrepresented census data. His grievous folly would offer cover to the darkest forces in American politics and could have dramatic consequences in this fall's presidential election. This is John Roberts' legacy, and you don't have to take it just from me. This would become John Roberts' life's work, undermining voting rights and the Voting Rights Act, Charles Fried told me. Freed knew Roberts for decades, and he's no liberal. He was the Solicitor General under Ronald Reagan. He was the Federalist Society advisor at Roberts' alma mater of Harvard Law. He testified in favor of his nomination as Chief Justice and came to deeply regret his support. Any story of life's work should begin with one's boyhood. The rustic Americana that John Roberts described to the Senate committee did not have much relation to his actual youth. The future Chief Justice, who would grow up to determine that race was no longer a problem in American life, who would roll back the historic legislation that began our march toward multiracial democracy, spent his formative years in Long Beach, Indiana. This was not a farming town, but it was a lily-white suburban enclave on the shores of Lake Michigan, home to Chicago's wealthiest entrepreneurs. While John Lewis was beaten in Selma, while freedom riders died registering voters across Mississippi, while Lyndon Johnson muscled the Voting Rights Act through Congress, the boy who would eviscerate it all was cosseted in exclusive private schools and country clubs in a town built for whites only. Long Beach and the ritzy lakefront environs surrounding it remained one of the most segregated areas of the nation in 1965, decades after the federal government put an end to official housing discrimination. Early 20th century brochures advertising Long Beach real estate still touted a vacation in a, quote, highly restricted Caucasian school where, quote, all residents are Caucasian Gentiles. His father worked in upper management at Bethlehem Steel, and Robert spent summers working in a jobs program for executives' kids that paid between $12 and $16 an hour then. That's the equivalent of $88 to $117 an hour today. Roberts brought his Midwestern conservative outlook fully formed to Harvard and Harvard Law, where his professor Lawrence Tribe, who still wrestles with how a student so thoughtful and curious could have such blind spots, became an adherent of the nascent race neutrality theories that took hold of conservative legal thinking, the view grounded in opposition to busing and school education as hostile to whites, that any effort to eradicate racial discrimination is itself racial discrimination against whites. He clerked for Justice William Rehnquist at the Supreme Court, a man with a very personal connection to voter intimidation, as he personally took part in some of the most toxic efforts to challenge individual Black and Latino voters in Arizona in the 1960s. He worked in a chambers so crucial to the development of the conservative legal movement that it has been described as the Federalist Society before there was a Federalist Society. He was fast-tracked from there straight into its next crucible, Ronald Reagan's Department of Justice. Roberts, 26 years old, just off his clerkship, not far removed from Long Beach, was hired as a special assistant to the Attorney General. The most important piece of the portfolio, this youthful aide, blissfully untouched by the struggle for the ballot, he was handed voting rights. And at a consequential moment, the 1982 reauthorization was underway, and there was one major question at the heart of it. 2 years earlier, in a case called Mobile versus Bolden, a challenge to the very common form of government across the South and elsewhere, which was city councils elected at large rather than from districts. This is a pretty effective way to guarantee that even cities with large Black populations, and Mobile had the second largest in Alabama, would never be able to elect a Black representative. Indeed, it had never happened there. There was a brave lower court decision that did not last, that had actually forced Mobile to change its system of government. Instead, the Supreme Court in 1980 rules that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act applies only to intentional discrimination. In other words, it wasn't enough to show that a policy disproportionately harmed a protected group. You had to show that it was intended to do so specifically. And there was not exactly an email trail left behind 100 years earlier. This shut down enforcement of the Voting Rights Act almost immediately. And so civil rights and voting rights groups turned to the 1982 reauthorization. They needed to change the law to be even clearer that it covered both harmful effects and not just deliberate intent. The fight moved to Congress, where it was embraced by Democrats, by Republican moderates, by the political wing of the Reagan White House. Effectively everyone except a handful of the staunchest segregationists in the Senate and the Reagan Department of Justice, led behind the scenes by John Roberts. His memos from that era that I unearthed in the National Archives, they show how fiercely he fought for months. The memos, the talking points, the op-eds, the political guidance, the scripted testimony for the Attorney General, letters to senators, his refusal to accept defeat. Violations of Section 2, he said, should not be made too easy to prove, since they provide a basis for the most intrusive interference imaginable by federal courts into state and local processes. John Roberts lost this battle. Even in the Senate, he garnered only 8 votes. Even Strom Thurmond deserted him in the end. But there was an important lesson here that conservatives looking to gut the Voting Rights Act learned, that if you had 5 members of the Supreme Court, you could get this done. You would not need 51 in the Senate, 218 in the House, and a president who was on board. If the question in the 1982 reauthorization was intent versus effect, the focus in 2006 was on strengthening preclearance. And preclearance was the most important enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act. It effectively said that the localities and states that had a history of the worst racial suppression when it came to voting had to run all of their changes to election law and procedures past the Department of Justice before doing it. Over 5 decades, preclearance would catch the most serious offenders before they acted. It would scare off others who knew that they would not get away with it. It derailed thousands of modern-day efforts to cancel elections, restrict minority voting power through redistricting and other schemes, to move precincts at the last moment, to purge voter rolls with impunity. Not in 1965, but as the lengthiest report in congressional history concluded, still very much in 2005 in our modern day America. In his confirmation hearings in 2005, Roberts insisted he no longer believed that there were any constitutional questions having to do with the Voting Rights Act. He was not telling the truth, and the conservative legal movement knew it. The pieces were all coming together already not long after he was confirmed. The foundations funding the litigants, paying the lawyers, filing the amicus briefs, teeing up the cases for the justices they paid to rule on them, aware that it would only take those 5 votes. The crucial case here is called Shelby County versus Holder. It started not far from Selma in a tiny town called Calera, which is part of Shelby County, with a redrawn district line. This invisible boundary wrapped around a new Walmart. It bisected I-65 at the center of Alabama, and the political consequences would soon be revealed. Ernest Montgomery, just the second Black official elected to office in Calera's history, represented the council's only majority Black district. This invisible line, kept secret from the Department of Justice despite the requirements of the Voting Rights Act, turned his district from 71% Black to 70% white. As Calera grew, it made 177 annexations between 1993 and 2006. There was one big problem. Calera had failed to pre-clear any of the maps. They'd also forgotten to pre-clear any of the 177 annexations that made the new maps necessary. When the Department of Justice learned what was happening, it made clear that no valid election could be held on an uncleared map with uncleared annexations. Calera went ahead anyway. Preclearance gave the Department of Justice the power to void the election and to force the city to run the race again under the old maps. This time, Ernest Montgomery was reelected by a commanding margin. One might look at the Calera elections and conclude that preclearance had done its job in Shelby County, that the Voting Rights Act ultimately caught and prevented a subtle yet brazen effort that would have ensured an entirely white council, that it was working as lawmakers intended in 1965, protecting against continued discrimination very much alive 50 years later. This was not how Shelby County saw it. Led by generations of officials there, descended directly from the Alabama lieutenant governor who led the Dixiecrat walkout of the 1948 Convention over Segregation. This was not the way the conservative litigators and legal teams funded by the same foundations that funded the Federalist Society and the efforts to put conservatives on the bench. They would work together to challenge the very constitutionality of preclearance. John Roberts, meanwhile, had been planning for this day when the Voting Rights Act would return to his courtroom. 3 years later, a test case known as Northwest Austin allowed Roberts to carefully plant the seeds for Shelby County. A tiny municipal water board in a new Texas development posed a large constitutional question. It insisted that as a new board, it bore no responsibility for racial vote suppression in Texas, and it challenged the constitutionality of preclearance. Two lower courts agreed that the utility district could not bail out, and that preclearance remained a fair response by Congress. The racial disparities revealed in the 2006 legislative record differ little from what Congress found in 1975, wrote Federal Appeals Court Judge David Tatel. Before Tatel wrote his decision, he read every page of the 2006 congressional report and detailed the shocking stories he found of those canceled elections and last-second precinct switches across Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and other covered states. He did so, he told me, because I had no confidence that the Supreme Court would even look at the record. His fears were justified. During oral arguments on April 29, 2009, Roberts expressed impatience and sounded as if he simply didn't believe these challenges continued. No one doubts the history here, he said, but at what point does that history stop justifying action with respect to some jurisdictions, but not with respect to others? At some point, it begins to look like the idea is that this is going to go on forever. The court's 5 conservatives wanted to move on. Several appeared ready to reach the larger constitutional question. The liberals wanted to save preclearance. So Roberts brokered a deal. The water district would be allowed to bail out. Preclearance survived for the moment. The Chief Justice won praise from the media, from court watchers for his judicial statesmanship. In reality, the Chief Justice was busy digging a trench and setting a trap. The liberal justices, so eager to reach a compromise, scarcely seemed to notice the actual language of the deal they made. Things have changed in the South, Roberts declared, for them all. He had conned the liberals into signing on to a broad indictment of that need, aimed at a future case and a future decision. Then Roberts made one additional stealth play that helped assure the next challenge to the VRA would arise quickly and aided its success. He made an observation known as dicta. This is where Roberts gave birth to the fiction of a fundamental principle of equal sovereignty among states. The trouble with this principle is that it does not exist. Roberts created it with an ellipsis and what can only be read as deliberate misapplication of the law. Before Roberts wrote this, there was no such principle. The cases that Roberts cites as authorities for the idea of equality among states actually concern the equal footing doctrine, which secures equality among newly admitted states. It governs the process of admission to the Union. Indeed, the Supreme Court had rejected this precise ruling in a 1966 voting rights case, which upheld the act's constitutionality, in the very sentence that Roberts later cited as saying the opposite. He cut the clauses he didn't like and called it law. From the actual decision, in acceptable legislative fashion, Congress chose to limit its attention to the geographic areas where immediate action seemed necessary. The doctrine of the equality of states invoked by South Carolina does not bar this approach, for that doctrine applies only to the terms upon which states are admitted to the Union, and not to the remedies for local evils which have subsequently appeared. Here is what Roberts wrote. The act also differentiates between the states, despite our historic tradition that all the states enjoy equal sovereignty, he began. The doctrine of the equality of states, does not bar, remedies for local evils which have subsequently appeared. One phrase is missing. For that doctrine applies only to the terms upon which states are admitted to the Union. Disappeared completely. Liberal justices either did not notice or did not think Roberts would be so brazen as to write it into law, citing his own invented precedent the next time a preclearance case came before the court. They underestimated his chutzpah and his hubris. If Roberts started undermining the foundation from preclearance in Northwest Austin, 4 years later in Shelby County, he finished the job. Things had changed in the South, he quoted. The preclearance formula no longer considered current conditions, Roberts wrote, brushing aside the lengthy congressional record, singling out states for disparate treatment he held, citing himself and his own dicta to support his made-up tradition, failed to accord each state its equal sovereignty. That's right. The Chief Justice obliterated the most successful civil rights legislation this nation has ever seen, not just on flimsy criteria, but on no criteria at all. He made it up. This is a principle of constitutional law of which I had never heard, the conservative judge and legal scholar Richard Posner observed, for the excellent reason that there is no such principle. What Roberts didn't make up, he got wrong. Roberts based his reasoning that things had changed in the South on voter registration statistics that, to him, showed that blacks and whites had reached something close to parity, and that in some states, blacks had even surpassed whites. His opinion even included a chart ostensibly documenting this. He had the statistics backward. Roberts simply didn't understand how the census counted race. The Roberts charts count Hispanics as whites, even those who were not U.S. citizens and were therefore ineligible to vote. That basic error threw off all of his numbers and his registration data. When reporters asked the court to explain how he could have gotten something so basic, so wrong, the Chief Justice declined to answer questions. The court does not comment on its opinions, said a spokesperson, which speak for themselves. The one argument Roberts had in his favor, the progress viewed through a narrowing gap in white and black voter turnout, dissolved upon his decision. In March of 2024, the Brennan Center released a study on the growing racial turnout disparities. The difference in voting rates between white and non-white voters grew steadily over a dozen years and fastest in the states where the Chief Justice removed federal oversight. Shelby County prevented hundreds of thousands of votes from voters of color in formerly covered counties in the 2022 midterm elections, it concluded. Yet it didn't take a decade of study to confirm what happened next. The after effects began immediately. States had laws waiting, laws that they knew would not pass preclearance, and they simply waited for the court to take it away. In short order, the nation learned that John Roberts had created a vast playground for a new generation determined to suppress the votes of Black and minority Americans. Indeed, as the court would soon bless the most extreme partisan gerrymanders in American history, they enabled and empowered the fringe of the fringe, now legislative supermajorities as impervious and contemptuous of the ballot box as the Roberts Court. Within minutes of the Shelby County decision, then Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott tweeted that the state's voter ID law, the most stringent in the nation, passed prior to Shelby County, but blocked by a unanimous three-judge federal panel that found it would disenfranchise minorities and the poor, would go into effect immediately. State by state, lawmakers became ever more brazen. This was a court-enabled opportunity to seize power. It set in motion the array of state-endorsed ballot suppression measures, voter ID bills, precinct closures, voting purges, that have rendered the simple act of voting an onerous ordeal for all too many Americans. We are seeing the consequences of Shelby County at work right now in this presidential campaign with about 10 days left. In Georgia, the state election board's new procedures that threaten to slow certification and perhaps throw the 5-week period between Election Day and the meeting of the Electoral College into chaos. There's litigation underway to stop it. Some of it has been successful in early actions. But make no mistake, this would not have been possible without Shelby County. Preclearance would have prevented it. There would be no need for long litigation. This road to chaos, the Trump plan, which is so obviously apparent to all, to try to slow the certification process down, push this into the courts, and just so chaos and confusion when there is none, the road to chaos would have been blocked immediately. The purges that we are seeing in Texas, in Virginia, in Alabama, in so many states, could not have been done without this Supreme Court. We all know what Donald Trump's play here is. He wants to sow chaos. He wants to push the election as much as he can into the courts. He thinks that the courts will be on his side. And indeed, these courts have already slowed down his accountability under several of the charges he faced, including the charges from January 6th. They've already granted him widespread immunity. He is probably correct in assuming that the Supreme Court will help him if he can get it there. He's going to depend on those partisan judges. He's going to watch the calendar turn. There are any number of scenarios that could return the question to the Supreme Court that enabled the gerrymanders, that produced the extremists who helped pass the laws that the Supreme Court freed them to enact under the guise that things had changed in the South. That could mean that after 180 million of us vote, it could allow the final decision to be rendered by the unelected conservative supermajority on the court, 5 of them named by presidents who lost the popular vote, 3 of whom worked on the Bush versus Gore case that provided the proof of concept for the judicial capture plan, one of whose wife flew the insurrectionist flag outside their home, another of whose wife worked hand in hand with the insurrectionists. Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural, observed that the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon the vital questions of the day is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. John Roberts, meanwhile, went on C-SPAN in 2009 and noted that the most important thing for the public to understand is that we're not a political branch of government. They do not elect us. If they do not like what we are doing, it's more or less just too bad. Thank you.
Thank you, David. A few thoughts and a few questions here. You know, our previous speaker, the scholar Martha S. Jones, mentioned that even if Kamala Harris wins, we should be prepared for disappointment when it comes to the Supreme Court. I think we could agree on that. But she says it doesn't mean that you shouldn't take cases all the way up there, because one of the things that it does, it actually forces them to show their hand, and that this is actually very, very important. If we could talk a little bit about, you know, where do we go from a Harris administration? Because we've still got some serious problems here.
Very serious problems. I mean, I think that if, let's assume that the vice president is elected, I think that the Supreme Court is set up to serve as the check on her powers. That they have gutted the regulatory state in the Loper-Bright decision, effectively, in many ways, paralyzing the ability of agencies to do their job. I think that this court will stop anything she tries to do via executive action, as we have already seen during the Biden years, and that the vice president, if elected president, will have a very frustrating first 4 years unless if she embarks on an ambitious course of structural reform to try and take on some of these deeply embedded minoritarian features of our government, all of which conservatives have weaponized and loopholes that they've driven trucks through over the course of these last few years in order to create their own entrenched and enduring minority rule. They have shown no problem in doing this. I have the greatest respect for Dr. Jones. I think she's a brilliant scholar. I'm not sure I agree with the strategy of continuing to take cases to a Supreme Court when we know what the outcome is going to be. We knew what the outcome would be in the Brnovich case out of Arizona, and the Supreme Court used it to continue the shredding of the Voting Rights Act. And that has, continuing to give the court opportunities to do what we know that they want to do might be the definition of insanity, right? Doing it again and again, hopeful that just this one time John Roberts will be our friend. I think it's really important to understand that John Roberts is not our friend. This is John Roberts' life's work. There are, and I say this generally, I think that too often on the left and among progressives and Democrats, there is this belief that the Supreme Court is a romantic institution because of the decisions it handed down in the Warren from the Warren Court that expanded and protected liberties in our own lifetime, and we imagine that the Warren Court could return. It's like a West Wing fantasy almost. The Warren Court was um, it was an apparition almost in Supreme Court history. This is not the Warren Court. It's not coming back. And we have to be really, I think, hard-nosed and understand that the Supreme Court is the base of Republican political power. And that is how they have used it. They captured it for that exact purpose. And the people who were put there are determined to keep that going. They're not going to change in midstream, right? There was something known as the greenhouse effect for many years, named after Linda Greenhouse, the great political report, a legal reporter for the New York Times. And the sense was that over time, conservative officials who lived in Washington became captive in some ways to the Georgetown mentality because they wanted to be approved of by Linda Greenhouse and the folks of the New York Times editorial page. And David Souter and folks like that, if you remember. And the modern Federalist Society grew out of a desire to create no more suitors. That was their mantra. And to create not only the judge-minting apparatus of the Federalist Society that would give them justices who they could count on for ideological certainty, but also to create the social circle in Washington in which they could operate, right? It's no accident that Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas are sent on these fancy vacations, given expensive dinners and retreats and European vacations and Alaska vacations and all of the donors' homes. It's because they know that if they go out in Georgetown or Silver Spring, Maryland for brunch, they will be booed, and nobody wants to be booed over pancakes and mimosas. So the Federalist Society has created this whole alternative social structure for them as well, uh, that they can be cosseted in, just as John Roberts was as a young man. This is a full cradle to grave operation that they've built.
Yeah. I remember when Barack Obama first came in and he was saying, come on, folks, force my hand a little bit. And what I'm wondering is, like, when Kamala gets in there, um, should we be giving her some pressure to do those structural changes that you're talking about? Maybe a groundswell, of public, action is what's needed here.
Yeah, I think that the structural change is big, right? I mean, any structural change that remakes institutions that we learned how they operate in fifth grade is a big deal. But the thing is, the American public is in favor of dramatic Supreme Court reform. Take term limits. The idea of limiting each justice to 18 years and giving, on a rotating basis, and giving each president 2 appointments. You find about 75% approval for that, even upwards of 70% among Republicans. This isn't controversial. I mean, you ask all Americans the question, I mean, should there be 9 people in a democracy who have this kind of outsized power for life who are unelected? And they say, no, that's insane, right? I mean, every other modern democracy in the world has said that's insane, except us. And the idea of a binding ethics code, uh, you know, again, you're looking at 75% support. They could move on things like that immediately. And then if you want to look at some of the bigger questions there, like expanding the number of justices, which I think absolutely has to be done, really right-sizing this court, especially in the way that seats have been stolen over the course of the last several years, and playing the kind of constitutional hardball back that's been played by Republicans. You have to build more public support for that, and that we will have to really make the case. But I think that the case can 100% be made. And sometimes just the process of making the case works, right? Sometimes people talk about FDR and the court, what they call the court packing scheme of the 1930s, and they talk about it as if it was a failure because Roosevelt didn't do it.
Yeah.
But simply by talking about it, he cowed so many of the justices who were business and corporate lackeys
Yeah.
who were trying to obstruct the New Deal simply
Yeah.
by saying, we're going to add justices and we're going to take away your power.
Yeah.
They came into line a little bit with where public
Yeah.
opinion was. And, do I think that Sam Alito is uh, able to be convinced by that? I don't. But I think that there's an argument to be made that simply by starting to have the conversation in a serious way,
Yeah.
you create impact.
Yeah. And I think that's where Martha S. Jones was actually coming from,
Yeah.
in her talk. She was moving in that, along those lines. Yeah.
Oh, she's brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Yes.
I'm wondering, on a sidebar now, electoral college. What are some of your thoughts about this?
I think that we have one office in this country which all of us elect, and we should all be able to vote for that office and feel like our vote actually counts. We should all elect that person by a national popular vote as compared to this, wild Rube Goldberg contraption that we've set up here, that if we were setting up a process now, you would never hit on this. And there's a reason why, here too, no other modern democracy does it this way, because it's completely insane. It doesn't do the things that its defenders say it does, right? It does not protect, if you were to have a national popular vote, you would not be letting New York and California pick the next president. There's just not enough New Yorkers and Californians to do that. And also, by the way, there's about 40% of New Yorkers and Californians that vote for Republicans. In the same way that if you were to look at Texas and Florida, there's more than 40% of people who vote for Democrats. So it's not like these blue states go 100, it's only in our wackadoodle electoral college system that a majority ends up looking like 100% of all the votes. Most of us, we were watching the World Series last night and actually saw a couple of political ads, which you don't otherwise see here in Massachusetts, because nobody cares about Massachusetts in the same way that nobody cares about you all in California or people in Oklahoma or Tennessee. There are 7 states that matter this year, and that's a lot because usually there's like 4. And the thing about this current system is that it's only 4 states that actually matter. And I haven't cast a ballot early, but because there's not a single competitive race on my ticket. I'll go over at some point, right? But my vote for president here doesn't make any bit of difference. And most people's do not, unless if you're in one of those 7 states. And
Yeah.
that is not the way it should be. We ought to have a popular vote that actually decides this so that the campaign comes to every state. It doesn't just it isn't just a carnival between 3 different states. I would like to get to see a Bruce Springsteen concert ahead of an election just once. I mean, come on. Why can't I see Beyonce? Just because I live in Massachusetts? I mean, I really do worry about the prospects that this election gets kicked into the Supreme Court. I think that a repeat of Bush versus Gore is very much a possibility, and a return of the independent state, a legislative a theory from the Moore versus Harper case a couple of years ago could get it there.
Yeah.
And that there's just so many possibilities that we have to be alert for. So I think I'll be really largely focused on that. And and then it all depends on who wins, because the president, the former president has said that critics of the Supreme Court are going to be jailed if he's reelected. So I may be doing a Zoom on the next book From Attica.
I certainly hope not.
It's going to be hard to do my research. I'll have a half hour a day on dial-up internet.
Oh, we have reached the end of this session. David Daley, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy you could be part of our proceedings. Really appreciate
Fun.
it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Say hello to Paul and to Erin.
Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, which is fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our public events, publishing program, and educational outreach are dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So thank you, everyone. Hope to see you shortly.
Excellent. Thanks again.